many years ago when I was a newly ordained priest back in the dark ages. I was living in a rectory, and there was a lady who came to the door one day, and she was looking to talk to a priest, and they referred her to me. I have to remember this was just after Vatican II happened, and this lady told me her story, which was a really kind of a inspiring story, but also a difficult story to hear. The story was that as a young woman, now we're talking about the 40s now, in the 40s, she got married to a man, and they went down to Reno or Las Vegas, one of those places, for a honeymoon. And after 3 days, he left. She never saw him again. He left her alone, and he took off. And that was heartbreaking enough to hear that. Well, she went on with her life and eventually got a divorce from him and found another man and was married to him for many years. But that's only part of her story. The other part is that every few years, she would go to a parish and she would find a priest and ask him if she could go to communion, because that first marriage was her valid marriage in the church, and she had a second marriage that was so that she was not valid in the church. And she would be told no. She would do this every 5 or 7 years for a number of times. And so when she came to our rectory, she was just asking the same question: can I receive communion? Well, luckily, or by work of God, at that time, Father Bert Griffin, who is a brilliant canon lawyer, and another canon lawyer in Louisiana, had worked out a way, and you have to remember, this was before the time when we did annulments in the church, really. But they had worked out a way that people in this situation, whose first marriage there's no way you could resolve it, but that they could have the privilege of the faith, as we'd say. And the privilege of the faith was that if they had good faith, they could go to communion. Well, this lady, talk about good faith. That's what she had, an abundance of. So I got the forms for that from Father Griffin, and I went to see her, and I told her what we were going to do, and filled out the forms and sent them in. Well, the response came back affirmative. She could go to communion because of her situation and because of the faith that she had shown. So my next step was to deliver that message to her. So I went to her house and I said, here's the result. You can go to communion. Well, you can imagine, she just broke down in tears. And her husband was with her, and he was kind of tearful also because he knew what his wife wanted so deeply. But then she had another question. And the second question was, where can I go to church to do this? Do I have to go over? And she lived down in the valley. And she said, do I have to go over to Salem, or do I have to go away from my house? And I said, no, any church you want to go to. Any Catholic church you can go to. You have this privilege now, this right. So she went to her local church, which was a very small community, and they welcomed her with open arms. And that was a second joyful event for her, that not only was she now receiving the Eucharist, which she yearned for, but she was welcomed into this community of faith, into this Eucharistic community. I think it's a wonderful story that has stuck with me over the years. But this woman who was yearning for the Eucharist, yearning for it, and I think on the other side, we can say that God was drawing her all the time. God was drawing her to himself, and she responded to that. Well, Jesus, in this gospel that we're reading for the last few weeks, is trying to present to these people an idea about Eucharist, an idea about not just Eucharist, but a Eucharistic community. And he's trying to present to people that he says this Eucharistic community is a Eucharistic meal, but it's beyond that. Jesus, he didn't have the words to talk about Eucharist that we have today. He didn't have words like transubstantiation and real presence. When I use those words, you know exactly what the Eucharist is, right? Well, most people don't. And those are kind of technical theological terms, and you have to go back in theology, Thomistic theology, and Aristotelian philosophy to understand what they are. And we do that a lot in the church. We presume people know what we mean when we talk about this. And it's like when we began using the new missal at Mass, and the creed had been altered a bit, and when first time I said Mass with that, and we used that creed, first person who came out of church said to me, "What did that word mean?" I couldn't figure out what they were talking about. They said, "That word that you used in the creed." Finally, I figured out consubstantiation or consubstantial. Well, it's another one of those technical words that people don't know what it means in the church. But Jesus was a kind of a similar situation. He didn't have any language like that to speak of the Eucharist, but he had as the language of the people, and that's what he tried to use all in his life when he was presenting his message. And so he talks about familiar things that they would know. He talks about bread. He talks about having a meal. He talks about living together, being with one another. Those are the simple things of people's lives, all of our lives, that we eat together and that we live with one another and we work to get along with one another. That's what Jesus wanted to use and wanted to show them, to speak to them about something, using something that was familiar to them to speak about this Eucharistic meal. What he said, but when he says, "Eat my flesh," that was tough. That was tough for people to get, tough for people to accept. They ask questions like, "Oh, does he want us to be cannibals, And is that what he's talking about?" And of course he wasn't, but it's still, and they struggled with this and they argued about this. And the word that they use in the gospel is they murmured, which is they were all in the back of the room talking to one another, I guess, arguing about what's he talking about? What does he mean? So Jesus uses an image that they knew. He uses an image from the Old Testament. We call it the Old Testament. It would have been his Bible, about the manna in the desert, the manna that God gave them, food that God gave them. And he says, "This food filled your stomachs, but I'm giving you something else, another kind of food, and that food will lift you up spiritually, and it will lift your spirits and bring you closer to God and to one another." And that's the step that he takes. And the food, he says, is me. Well, that's, again, creates a stumbling block. What does he mean by the food is me? I think what he means is just look at how I live. Look at what I do. Look at what I am. Listen to what I say. That's me. And this comes from God. He said, this is a different kind of food, to listen to his word, to listen to his message, to watch what he does. If you can do that, then you have a different kind of food that will lift you up and give you a life that's beyond the life that food gives us. But it's more than that. It's more than just me receiving the Eucharist. He emphasizes that if you do this Eucharistic meal, you become part of a community, just like he created a little community with his apostles, a community of the 12. And he wants them people to live their lives in this, we could call it a Eucharistic community, or a community of faith, just as you here in this parish are a Eucharistic community. That's what John is trying to create. And that's what he wants them to do. But to live as Jesus lived, it's very difficult. Those people knew it was difficult, and they knew that living as he lived and what he taught was really, really very difficult. So they murmured, they argued, and they struggled about it. In the early church, They struggled, they fought about it, and each town had something different about Jesus and who Jesus was. And the struggle went on and still goes on today. For example, we say, well, we care for one another. We don't lie, cheat, steal, good people. And that's good. I think that's really important that we are good people. But the message of Jesus at times presents to us a situation that's very difficult and that we won't always agree on. Let me give you one example, tough one. Jesus says at one point in Matthew's gospel, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. If someone hits you, you hit them back. You know, if someone does something wrong to you, you deal with them. But he says, I say to you, love your enemies. You will heap coals upon them if you love them." Well, what does he mean by loving your enemies? Does he mean that we're never supposed to have a war? We're not supposed to kill people in war. We're supposed to love them. Does he mean that people who have done horrible things, horrible, terrible things, killed hundreds of thousands of people, maybe sometimes some people in our history killed millions of people, what are we supposed to do? Forgive them? That's pretty hard. What even about somebody who hurts us deeply, who really has hurt us, maybe hurt our families? We're supposed to forgive them. We're supposed to love them. What about terrorists? We're supposed to love them. I think that if we had a chance, there would be some murmuring in this community about that. You know, there'd be different opinions here because that's very difficult. That's very tough stuff. But it's you know, and is Jesus asking that we forgive people, that we forgive the ones who harm us? Maybe, and we might even say, he's just asking too much, or he doesn't really mean it that way, you know. He means something else. We can shade it and try to put it in different frames and try to talk about it differently. Maybe he does. Maybe he really means that. But I think that another piece of this is that when we struggle with these things that Jesus says and how hard they are sometimes for us, I think we need to understand also that he doesn't expect people to stand alone. He doesn't expect everybody to stand by themselves and do this, because as I mentioned, what he wants to do is create a community in which people support one another, a community in which they understand that God is present there and God is supporting them and they support one another. That's that Eucharistic community. Jesus knew the struggles of his own disciples. They didn't agree with him. They didn't agree with one another. They fought with one another. They wanted power over one another. I mean, he knew that struggles would go on. He was a realist in that way. And so, but what Jesus asked of them is the same thing that he gave them. He asked of them faith in him. Now, unfortunately, that word faith is now another technical term, like I mentioned earlier. Faith is a kind of like an intellectual understanding. If you could say, I believe in God, well, we have faith. But I think if we can change the word faith, use a different word for it, it might bring it home more. And the word that I would use is the word loyalty. Loyalty. That's what Jesus wanted from his disciples, was to be loyal to him as he was loyal to them. And he was loyal to them to the very end. Even though they betrayed him, even though they ran away when he needed them the most, he was loyal to them. That's what he wanted. And it's something that God did. You know, the God of Mount Sinai, the God, the people of the Exodus, the people who went out into the desert, the God that they knew was, as somebody said, was the God of relationships, of fidelity. The God who was faithful to his people, always faithful to them, no matter what they did. And that's what God wanted from those people, to be loyal to him as he was to them. That God wanted them to be loyal to him and not choose other gods. That's what loyalty means, is to be true to somebody, right? That's what loyalty is about, being loyal to another person, as we know. If you read almost any book of of what we call the Old Testament, for Jesus, it would be his Bible. In every one of those books, you could hear God saying, "You've run away from me. You've left me. You've gone another place. You aren't loyal to me. I want you to come back. I want you to be loyal to me as I am to you, because I have never abandoned you." That's what God is saying to them, and what Jesus is saying to us. And what he wants to create is these Eucharistic communities like we have here in this parish, in which we are loyal to God and to one another. That's what he wants, that us to be loyal to one another, to not run away from one another, even though we differ, even though we argue about things, even though we have various differences of opinions and ideas. What he wants is our loyalty. So use that word in place of faith, and I think it gets us farther. Jesus showed that loyalty to the very end of his life. He never rejected his disciples, and he never rejected anybody. He even loved his enemies. As is on the cross, it's reported, he said the words, "Forgive them, Father, for they don't know what they're doing." He was loyal. He was loyal to God. He loved his enemies, even as they killed him. That's what he asks of us. I don't know how hard that is. I don't know, because I have never faced that. And I think it's very difficult what Jesus asks. But he doesn't ask it again. What he asks is for us to create a community in which that might be possible. A community of loyalty to one another, in which we know that loyalty exists, and that we can then live his message more deeply.